Billy was a bad boy who couldn't bawl. Not only could he not cry noisily, he couldn't cry quietly. Ever. He grew up with a dad who was angry, and in the household there were 3 boys. Billy was the oldest one. And if dad saw tears or hurt in any of the boys, he would just say, "Son, you're never going to make it in life if you're weak like that." And those words were etched into Billy's consciousness so that he learned those are the rules. Not just the rules of the family, these are the rules of life. All very unconscious. In fact, Billy wasn't aware of any of that. He just knew that when he was in school, he liked to pick on other kids. He sometimes felt bad about it afterwards, but he also knew that he got attention and love that way. There was something that he didn't like about kids who looked weak or vulnerable. It's like he kind of knew what dad meant. It's just they're never going to make it. So he felt like it was his job to let them know that, just like dad told him. But that looks like bullying, of course, to those kids, and Billy would often get in trouble. His dad would yell at him for it, but then he wouldn't cry. He held it in, everything. By the time he was in high school, Billy was not only feared by every boy and then admired by boys because he had that big energy, the bad boy attitude, but also the girls, they liked him. Many of the quiet girls, even the ones who had angry fathers, who were kind of peaceful girls, good girls, they liked him because that energy. It was kind of like dad, but they weren't conscious of it exactly. He was handsome. So that, with that big energy, was just, for some girls, all it took. He never had a problem, Billy didn't, getting a girl. But his problem was keeping them because they wanted more than he could give. And he would kind of discard them when they would want too much. He couldn't give it. I mean, to really be loving is not something that he was ever taught. He doesn't know how to do that. So after a while, his looks wear off and he doesn't give anything else. And it makes these girls feel bad. And when they bring it up, he just thinks that they're blaming him for their stuff. So those relationships end. And so even though Billy, as he grows older, has this big energy and can sometimes appear very confident, he's suffering inside the way that many men do who have to conform to some image that isn't what they really are. And they have to suffer silently. Camille Paglia called the male gender the silent suicide sex. But I think it has more to do with the repression of vulnerable emotions and how men in our culture often have to do that to appear whatever is, represents being a man. A lot of people silently suffering like Billy. So I want you to imagine then that Billy suffers enough. So what's his suffering? If he has hurt repression, what is it going to look like at the conscious level for Billy? It's going to look like being kind of a bully sometimes, getting angry instead of showing vulnerability in personal relationships. Later on, there's going to be some addiction in his life, which is coming straight from, the need to soothe the fear of hurt, feeling and expressing hurt, getting hurt. There'll be depression at a certain point because that's safer than feeling and expressing the vulnerable stuff. He's going to live with a kind of anxiety. I'm trying to give you the profile of Billy the adult before I take you into his awakening process, but he's definitely going to be suffering. He's not going to know where it's coming from. Like many people with that repression, his own anger could bamboozle him. He might, for a while, treat his issue as an anger problem. That's safer than the vulnerable emotions. So let's just say that he has all this suffering. He doesn't know that it's coming from hurt repression, but now he becomes interested in healing and freedom. So he doesn't like the vulnerable stuff. He doesn't want to do therapy, but he discovers non-duality or awakening. And he's like, well, that's what I need, is to discover what I really am. But by completely avoiding the spectrum of vulnerable emotions buried in his body, he can't awaken to what he is, and he certainly can't embody it, so the suffering doesn't end. And the other thing about that is that when he goes to meetings like quiet meditation meetings or satsangs where teachers are leading certain practices, his anger is disruptive. And the thing about spirituality, there's a lot of anger repressors who are teachers and people who follow work. And so there's a kind of a discrimination that Billy experiences in the story. He sits down, he walks in to a retreat like everyone else, but he gets upset with some of the things that are said, and he vocalizes it. And people look at him like, man, you're not gonna make it here. We don't do that. That's because the anger repressors around him, they don't do that. So he feels out of place, and it takes him longer to discover his freedom because of the bias there. But let's just say after a while, he finally becomes open, not just to the awareness part, but to the vulnerable emotions that he's buried. And then Billy can start to end his suffering finally. It can only really begin when he discovers the hurt repression. Everything else is a prolonging of the suffering to stay safe and get love as a separate self. Even though he became interested in the awakening, it's the buried emotions that create the duality for him. For example, one of the aspects of his big energy is he doesn't like to be wrong with his girlfriends or other people. Well, that's because that gets too close to the buried hurt. But see, when he's arguing with his partners, that never comes out, that he's trying to be right because he is afraid. And so there's the conflict and the suffering that comes into relationship. All sorts of things come directly from his hurt repression, like not taking ownership in relationship. It's just too scary for people with vulnerable emotions. Buried. But I really want to just end the story here. Just to say he discovers the repression work and he finally ends his suffering. And the reason I want to tell the story that way, to end it that way, is because it often doesn't end that way with emotional repression. First of all, people like Billy might not even find their way into non-duality. I've seen that. And even if they do, they might face discrimination and might not understand. Like if you're sitting with an anger repressing teacher, they're not going to be able to help you much as a hurt repressor unless they do repression work. Because like I was saying in the story, if you get angry at a meeting, is that teacher going to know where that's coming from? You don't. That's why you're there. If the teacher doesn't, you're both bamboozled. You're in a trauma bond. So how is the teacher bonding with you? By staying safe from their buried anger. So if you get angry at a meeting, they're not going to be totally allowing of that, other than to say, well, just allow it. But that's not really allowing of that, because the anger for Billy would be a coping mechanism coming from the buried hurt. So many teachers would gaslight him and lead him to believe that there's no buried hurt there by omitting that and pointing to how the anger comes and goes. And there might be even a little bit of judgment on the anger from people at meetings. This is something that just goes on, guys. And there's a lot of people who are hurt and sadness repressors who haven't always felt at home in spirituality. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this, a couple of reasons, this short little story was this. One, as an anger repressing teacher who does repression work with people, obviously there's a bias around anger repression. I see so much of it in spirituality. But it's so important to cover this too, that not everybody's an anger repressor. And some people repress all emotions. And I want to talk about that in my podcast this season. I'm going to be telling stories of people with different repression so you can see it. But the other reason I'm telling the story is, well, so that hurt and sadness repressors feel more represented here, because me and Dan are both anger repressors. But also to address what I do see and to make amends for a bias. I have now seen that there's not only anger repression predominant in spirituality, but historically, when I look at the practices that are bypassing and so much focus on presence and even stillness, that I think that these practices and teachings, a lot of them were developed by anger repressors. And I know I was one, and I didn't have a clear and conscious perspective around hurt repression because of it. Frankly, it was my shadow. People who could be overtly angry were my shadow as an anger repressor. So I want to make amends for that. Having not done my work, I couldn't meet you. And now you're welcome here in this work completely. I'm actually in a relationship with a hurt repressor. So you're welcome here. Thank you for listening. And again, if you guys want to get started on the work, the best thing to do, maybe if you're not sure about starting it, is just get on our newsletter. So you go to repressiontest.com, you take our test, and then it tells you automatically what your repression is. Then when you're on the newsletter, you can hear everything that we're saying from within that understanding, and it'll just make sense more. But if you're ready to start the work, if I can remember, I'm going to put a link here in the comments to just help you get started with it if you're ready. Thank you for listening. Oh, one more thing. Telling stories, there's a risk to it in that you can characterize a certain repression a certain way. Not every hurt repressor shows up like Billy. That would be super unfair to say that or to lead people, because frankly, hurt repression shows up in a bunch of different ways. Not every hurt repressor can get angry or express it. Not every hurt repressor has big energy or is a bully. And so you'll see those different stories on this podcast episode, but I wanted to start with one that's kind of a classic hurt repressor, so to speak, where anger is safer. Thank you for listening.